She was 24 and broke. No lease, no family room, no car, just a canvas tool bag and $18.43 she had kept by skipping meals and selling her winter coat. And with $6 of it, she bought a forgotten wooden toy train workshop near Willapa Bay in Pacific County, Washington, last marked on county maps in 1978. The north sill had rotted through beneath the wall. Rain entered through 3 seams in the cedar roof. The county condemned it on October 14th, 2022, with demolition planned for the following spring. But inside an iron boiler drum, sealed behind a riveted cedar disc for 71 years, waited $53,257 and a handwritten journal bearing her grandfather's name. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Opal Mercer had been fitting small pieces together her whole life without knowing it. She grew up in rented duplexes between Tacoma and Aberdeen, where every bedroom wall carried the pale rectangles left by somebody else's pictures. Her toys came from church basements and paper grocery sacks. When something broke, she did not ask for another. She studied the break, found glue or thread, and made the object useful again. Her mother, Elaine, worked the breakfast shift at a motel and treated permanence as a luxury other people could afford. She kept bills beneath a ceramic rooster and answered difficult questions by wiping an already clean counter. The one steady place was her grandfather Amos Mercer's narrow garage in Hoquiam. Every Saturday, he set a pine board across 2 sawhorses and taught Opal to turn blocks of maple into wooden locomotives. He showed her how to mark axle holes with an awl before drilling, how to test a wheel against a steel square, and how to sand with the grain until the corners felt worn by years rather than made that morning. At noon, they ate tomato sandwiches beside a coffee can of dowels. Afterward, Amos heated beeswax and walnut oil in a chipped saucepan, 3 parts wax to 1 part oil, then rubbed the warm finish into each car with folded cotton. Opal coupled the engine, tender, and caboose, then pushed the train along a plank and listened for a wheel sitting too high. Patience is just accuracy given enough time, Amos told her. She understood it later. Careful work was not slow because it lacked courage. It was slow because it refused to lie. He died when Opal was 17 after a stroke that left his right hand curled against the blanket. Elaine cleared the garage before the funeral flowers browned. The carving knives, brass wheel gauges, paper patterns, and 6 unfinished engines went to an estate buyer. Opal returned from school to find only sawdust under the bench and 1 cedar wheel blank in the gutter. Years later, Elaine married Vernon Pike, a property manager who wore soft-soled shoes. His control arrived as labels on pantry shelves, thermostat settings written on masking tape, and questions asked twice when the first answer displeased him. He called Opal's repair work little projects and charged her rent for the converted laundry room, though the room still smelled of bleach whenever the pipes warmed. On August 29, 2022, Opal came home to find her canvas tool bag standing upright beside the door. Vernon had buckled its flap with care. Her folded clothes filled a black trash sack, and the cedar wheel blank rested on top as if placed there for inspection. He did not look angry. Elaine stood near the sink with both hands around the ceramic rooster. Exactly 8 words, spoken without heat. Opal looked at her mother, waiting for one objection, one movement toward the door, even the smallest shake of the head. Elaine lowered her eyes and rubbed her thumb across the rooster's red comb. Opal lifted the bag, tucked the cedar disc into its side pocket, and walked out before Vernon could explain himself further. For 6 weeks she moved south and west according to weather, bus fare, and where a woman alone could sit without being questioned. In Tacoma, she slept 3 nights beneath a laundromat awning, waking whenever the change machine rattled. In Olympia, she paid $28 for a hostel bunk, then spent 2 nights in a hospital waiting room until a security guard with silver eyebrows quietly pointed her toward the all-night bus station. Aberdeen gave her a church cot for 4 evenings. Raymond gave her an unlocked picnic shelter beside the Willapa River. where rain blew sideways across the bench. Her money diminished by exact, humiliating amounts, $211.08 after selling her phone, $146.63 after bus tickets, $72.19 after food, and one pair of dry socks. She wrote each figure inside the tool bag flap with a carpenter's pencil. By the time she reached South Bend, she had $18.43, 2 granola bars, and the cedar wheel blank Amos had once told her was too fine-grained to waste. Rain drove her into the South Bend Timberland Library on October 17th. She dried her sleeves beneath a hand dryer, then read local notices pinned beside the tax forms. Most offered firewood, crab pots, or rooms she could not afford. One county notice had been typed crookedly, abandoned commercial structure, as is transfer, $6 plus recording, former Mercer Wooden Rail Works, demolition pending, inquiries at county clerk. She read the surname twice. Then she took the cedar blank from her bag and laid it against the paper. Both carried the same emblem, a locomotive wheel crossed by a carpenter's square. At closing time, Opal spent $14.45 on bread, cheese, and a bus ticket north. She kept $6 folded separately in the inner pocket of her coat. By morning, she would learn whether the workshop was merely condemned property, though the last unfinished thing her grandfather had left behind. The bus carried Opal north beneath a sky the color of wet tin, then left her beside US Route 101 with 12 miles still between her and the county office. She walked 7 before darkness gathered in the ditches. A dairy farmer allowed her to sleep in the loft above his hay, where the air smelled of clover and old rope, and the temperature fell to 37 degrees before dawn. She kept her boots on and tucked the tool bag beneath her head. The remaining 5 miles took her through a steady coastal rain. By 9 o'clock, South Bend had opened itself in small, practical increments. Klein's Hardware rolling up its steel shutter, Pearl's Cafe setting a chalkboard on the sidewalk, Harbour Drug lighting its green window sign, Madson's Feed unlocking a warehouse door, and Willapa Marine Works lowering a skiff from a trailer. No one hurried, trucks hissed across wet pavement, and gulls watched from the courthouse roof. The Pacific County Clerk's office occupied the first floor beneath a broad staircase worn hollow at its center. Opal entered with rainwater darkening the shoulders of her coat. The room smelled of paper, floor wax, and the faint heat of an electric baseboard. Behind a walnut counter sat a woman with one silver braid resting over her left shoulder. Her nameplate read MRS Idien A. Voss, Deputy Clerk. Opal placed the notice and 6 folded dollars on the counter. Mrs. Voss studied the money first, then Opal's wet cuffs. "You understand the property is condemned?" "Yes." "Ma'am?" "Yes."
Ma'am.
"Yes." "Ma'am." "Yes." "Ma'am?" Mrs. Voss leaned back. The chair gave one brief wooden complaint. Opal looked at the rain travelling down the tall windows. "Not that belongs to me." The deputy clerk removed a file from a lower drawer. Its green cover had softened at the corners, and the workshop's parcel number had been corrected twice in red pencil. She explained that the $6 price represented a statutory transfer of abandoned property with delinquent value already waived. Recording would ordinarily cost more, but a preservation exemption covered the balance if Opal signed an affidavit accepting all structural risk. Opal signed each page with the carpenter's pencil because the office pen had gone dry. Mrs. Voss pressed a brass stamp into a red pad and brought it down with both hands. The seal made a deep, final sound. She gave Opal a carbon copy, a narrow iron key, and directions spoken with the precision of someone who had repeated them for years. Take Highway 101 north for 2 miles. Turn left on Wilson Creek Road just beyond the old tide gate. Follow it until the pavement ends. At the split, keep right beside the drainage canal. The workshop is past the second stand of walnut trees. Then Mrs. Voss lifted the deed again. "Mercer," she said. Opal's fingers tightened around the key. The woman opened an older ledger and ran one blunt fingernail down a column of names. Amos Mercer came here every summer when he was young. Worked under Silas Mercer. If memory serves, quiet boy. Built little freight engines for the cannery families. Mrs. Voss looked up fully then. Behind her glasses, her eyes had the washed blue of harbour glass. I wondered. You have his mouth. Opal did not know what answer belonged to that, so she said nothing. Mrs. Voss crossed the room to a filing cabinet marked Historic Commercial. From it she drew a black and white photograph curled like bark. 3 men stood outside a narrow wooden building. One was Silas Mercer, identified in ink. Beside him, no older than 19, stood Amos with a wooden locomotive balanced across both palms. He asked about the property in 1989, Mrs. Voss said. The title was tangled then. By the time the county cleared it, we had no address for him. She slid the photograph into the deed envelope and pushed the $6 back across the counter. The law requires consideration, she said. $1 is sufficient. Opal separated a single bill. Mrs. Voss folded it once and placed it beneath the desk blotter. That will satisfy the county. Outside, the rain had thinned to mist. Opal followed Highway 101 while logging trucks passed in gusts of spray. Wilson Creek Road narrowed between alder and Sitka spruce. At the pavement's end, she met an elderly man repairing a mailbox with copper wire. A black dog with one white paw stood beside him without barking. You heading to the Mercer place? The man asked. Opal nodded. He twisted the wire tight. Roof leaks west of the ridge. Well, still runs if the leather cup has not dried out. The dog approached, smelled her tool bag, then returned to the man. I'm Hollis Crane, he said. That's Bishop. We live the next half-mile east. At her surname, Hollis paused, but he did not ask a question. He only pointed down the right fork. Walnuts will show you. There were 7 trees planted in 2 uneven rows along a rise above the marsh. Their leaves had turned yellow and lay plastered against the track. Beyond them stood the workshop, longer and lower than Opal had imagined, built from weathered cedar boards over a stone foundation. It measured perhaps 24 feet across and 48 feet deep. Moss weighted the north slope of the roof. A square brick chimney leaned slightly seaward. Above the double doors a faded sign still carried 3 readable words, Mercer Wooden Rail. She stood beneath it with the deed inside her coat. The iron key resisted twice before turning. When Opal leaned her shoulder against the door, something heavy dragged across the floor on the other side. A smell of wet cedar, machine oil, mouse nests, and decades of enclosed dust moved past her into the cold air. The front room held a long counter and empty wall shelves. Rain tapped through a roof seam into a galvanized bucket, each drop ringing with a different pitch as the water deepened. Her fingertips found curled paint along the window frame. Beneath her boots, sawdust had hardened into ridges. She tasted salt on her upper lip from the walk. The back room was darker and warmer. Shapes emerged slowly. A treadle lathe, a drill press with a leather belt, wooden bins and an iron boiler drum standing upright beside the chimney. When she touched the drum, rust came away like cinnamon on her palm. Somewhere inside the wall a mouse scratched once, then became still. Opal opened the rear door. The hinges shrieked sharply enough to send 2 crows from the walnut trees. Beyond a narrow yard, reeds leaned toward a tidal creek. Water moved through them with a slow sucking sound, carrying the clean mineral smell of mud and rain. She returned before dark and shifted the fallen display cabinet that had blocked the entrance. From beneath the counter she found a broom with half its bristles, a dented kettle, and a square of canvas stiff with age. She swept one section of floor, spread her coat over the canvas, and ate bread with thin slices of cheese. The building changed after sunset. Wind entered the roof seams in low notes. Water clicked inside an unseen pipe. The chimney released a grainy smell of old soot whenever the gust strengthened. Opal lay with the tool bag against her ribs and Amos's photograph beneath her folded deed. Moonlight reached through a broken pane and touched the boiler drum at the back of the room. What is made with patience remembers the hands that kept it. At first light, Opal carried the dented kettle outside and followed Hollis Crane's directions to the well. The pump stood beneath a cedar hood 50 yards behind the workshop, its handle silvered by weather. She removed the top plate, soaked the dried leather cup in creek water, and worked the handle until brown water coughed through the spout. By the 20th stroke it ran clear enough to catch the grey sky. The outhouse leaned toward the marsh but remained sound below the roofline. Opal swept out fir needles, replaced one hinge pin with a bent nail, and tied the door shut with cord from her tool bag. During those first 3 days she learned the workshop by sound. The plank near the front counter clicked once. The board beside the lathe gave 2 soft knocks. The floor behind the boiler drum made no noise at all. She walked into town on the 4th morning carrying a list written on the back of the condemnation notice. Klein's hardware was narrow and deep, with cast-iron skillets hanging above bins of screws and a smell of linseed oil embedded in the floor. Its owner, Arlen Klein, had lost the tip of his left index finger and used the shortened hand to count change against his thumb. He read Opal's list, then looked over her coat and muddy boots. He priced the supplies anyway. A chimney brush for $18.75, 20 feet of fiberglass rod for $11.40, stove cement for $6.25, a galvanized ash bucket for $9.60, and 2 pounds of rags for $3.10. Opal placed her remaining money on the counter. It would not cover half. Arlen pushed the coins back. She looked toward the street, unwilling to accept what she could not promise to repay. Arlen tore a page from a ledger and wrote her name at the top. Repair the chimney before you light anything. Pay when the building stops eating your money. From beneath the counter, he brought out a faded manual titled Rural Dwelling Repairs, 1948 edition. The cover had been patched with grey tape. Government printed too many, he said. No charge. The chimney took most of that day and half the next. Opal tied a length of rope to the brush, climbed to the roof by placing a ladder against the southeastern eave, and removed the cracked clay cap. She lowered the brush 1 rod at a time, twisting clockwise so the threaded sections would not separate inside the flue. The first pull brought down dry soot. The third released scales of creosote thick as broken pottery. Inside she had sealed the fireplace opening with canvas, and left one lower corner loose around the rope. Each downward stroke filled the cloth until it sagged black. She worked for 5 hours, rested her shoulders, then scraped the smoke shelf with a narrow putty knife. A dead swallow nest came loose with 2 corroded nails and the wing case of a beetle. The flue tiles were intact. One mortar joint had opened near the throat, so she dampened it and pressed in stove cement with a gloved finger. By the time she carried the last ash bucket outside, her hair smelled bitter and her palms had raised 2 blisters. She waited until morning before testing it. Opal built the first fire small, cedar shavings, 3 dry twigs, then 2 pieces of split alder Hollis had left beneath the walnut trees. Smoke climbed without hesitation. It did not curl into the room or seep from the chimney breast. She held a strip of newspaper near the opening and watched it bend toward the draught. For supper, she heated water in the kettle, added oats and the final pieces of cheese, and ate beside the hearth from a chipped enamel cup. The warmth reached only a few feet, but it lifted the damp smell from the boards. For the first time since August, she removed her boots before sleeping. Rain kept her inside the following day, so she began clearing the back workroom. She uncovered a treadle lathe with 4 turning chisels still nested in its rack, a brass drill guide, 7 maple wheel blanks, a box of steel axles wrapped in waxed paper, a wooden gauge marked for 3 train sizes, 2 locomotive patterns pierced with pinholes, and an iron branding stamp shaped like a wheel crossed by a square. The last object stood on the lower shelf beside the chimney, a half-finished freight car with 1 wheel missing. Opal placed the cedar blank from Amos's garage against the empty axle. It fit. She sat on the floor for several minutes with the freight car across her knees. Then the rain shifted westward, and a drop struck the boiler drum behind her with a dense metallic note. Opal turned. The drum was an old vertical steam vessel, nearly 4 feet high and wide enough that she could not circle it with both arms. Its iron lid had been welded closed. A feed pipe entered one side. Though the pipe had been cut flush and plugged with cedar, she knocked along the upper wall with the wooden handle of a chisel. Most of the iron rang hollow. The lower third answered differently. She tapped again, moving an inch at a time. The tone changed at a clean horizontal line, as though something heavy rested inside above the curved base. She pushed the drum. It rocked less than its size suggested, then settled with a quiet internal shift. Opal wiped rust from the plugged feed opening. The cedar was not a crude stopper. It was a fitted disc, turned smooth on a lathe and sealed around its rim with dark wax. The crossed wheel emblem had been pressed into its center. She measured the disc, selected the narrowest chisel, and spent 40 minutes freeing the wax without splitting the wood. When the edge loosened, she threaded a screw into the center only far enough to grip. The disc came out with a soft breath of trapped air carrying cedar, metal, and something faintly medicinal. Behind it was not the open belly of the drum, but a wooden sleeve. Opal reached in and felt canvas. She drew out the first package with both hands. It had been wrapped in oilcloth and tied with waxed linen thread. Inside lay 6 carving tools, 2 skew chisels, a small gouge, a veining tool, a wheel knife, and a burnisher made from polished bone. Their handles were apple wood, darkened where fingers had held them. The second package contained billets of maple and pear, each marked with a year and drying weight. None had warped. The third was a tin box with a sliding latch. Beneath it lay a leather-bound journal and an envelope addressed in brown ink, "My dear one, W.H. whoever you are." Opal did not open either. She carried everything to the front counter and returned to the drum with a lantern. Near the bottom, beneath a false floor of cedar boards, she found 4 canvas bank sacks and a narrow walnut case. She opened the sacks one at a time. There were paper notes wrapped in bands, silver dollars stacked in cloth tubes, Liberty Head half-eagles nested between layers of felt, and rolls of mercury dimes blackened only at the edges. She counted twice using the clerk's deed envelope as a tally sheet. The notes totaled $47,620. The gold pieces added $4,875. The silver dollars and dimes came to $762. Together they made $53,257. The walnut case held no money. Inside rested a purple heart engraved with the name Daniel Mercer and the year 1944. Its ribbon folded beneath the medal so carefully that the fabric still held a straight edge. By dusk, every object lay in orderly rows across the counter. Opal placed the money back into its sacks, returned the medal to the case, and set the unopened letter on top of the journal. Her fingers left a soot mark beside the first word of the address. She erased it gently with a piece of bread. Then she went outside. The rain had stopped. Water moved through Wilson Creek toward Willapa Bay, dark except where the clouds opened and gave it a narrow path of light. Opal stood beneath the walnut trees until cold entered her sleeves. Behind her the workshop held more money than she had ever touched, and a letter written by someone who had expected a stranger. She did not read it that night. What is made with patience remembers the hands that kept it. Morning entered through the broken front pane in a pale strip and reached the envelope before it reached Opal's face. She boiled water, washed the soot from her hands, and sat at the counter with the journal closed beside her. The handwriting slanted slightly forward, each capital formed with the same narrow loop Amos used when he labelled axle sizes. She knew the hand before she broke the seal. "My dear one, whoever you are, if you're reading this," then the boiler held. The cedar plug remained dry, and someone patient enough to notice an altered sound has come into the shop. My name is Ruth Mercer Bell. In March of 1951, Dr. Harold Nissen at St. Vincent Hospital in Portland told me the weakness in my legs was caused by multiple sclerosis. He advised me to leave the coastal damp and said I might have several useful years, though he could not promise how many. I returned here instead. Useful years are measured by the work one can finish. Our line began with Elias Mercer, born in 1831 near Bangor, Maine, who came west by ship and opened this shop in 1878. His son Silas, born here in 1864, changed the wheel pattern and taught the cannery families to make repairs themselves. Silas's daughter Beatrice, born in 1888, cut locomotive bodies while her brothers were away. I was Beatrice. I was Four generations worked beneath this roof before the order book closed on October 6, 1951. The shop has been silent for more than 30 years as I write this. Silence does not always mean an ending. Sometimes it means the work has been covered until the right hands arrive. The tools are older than I am. Keep the skew chisels honed at 25 degrees. 4 axle holes 1/64th larger than the steel pins, or damp weather will bind the wheels. Heat the beeswax finish no higher than 150 degrees and mix 3 measures wax with 1 measure walnut oil. After the final coat, wait 12 hours before fitting the couplers. Children test careless work more honestly than inspectors do. The money came from the shop, from wartime bonds, and from small payments saved when customers could not afford the full price. It does not belong to comfort alone. Use only what protects the roof, the tools, and the possibility of work. Leave some for the person who comes after you. Inheritance is not possession. It is the decision to sharpen a blade before putting it away, to mark the true center, and to repair what another pair of hands will need. A person does not have to share your blood to continue your care. Behind the workshop, past the leaning fence post, you will find a flat stone bearing the crossed wheel. Beneath it is a small lamp made by Silas from a locomotive boiler sight glass. Light it once, then decide nothing until morning. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. Ruth Mercer Bell, November 2, 1984. Opal read the letter once without moving. She read it again with the heel of her hand pressed against the counter. Then she aligned its edges, folded it along the original creases, and returned it to the envelope. The paper made the soft, dry sound of a map being closed. Outside, the morning had cleared. She passed through the back door, crossed the wet grass, and found the leaning fence post near the edge of the reeds. Ivy covered the ground beneath it. Opal pulled the vines aside until her nails filled with black soil. The marker was a flat slab of basalt no larger than a dinner plate. Moss softened the crossed wheel carved into its face. She lifted one edge with the narrow chisel and found a shallow cavity lined with cedar. Inside rested a brass lamp with thick glass no longer than her palm. She carried it into the workshop, cleaned the wick tube with a piece of wire, and filled the reservoir with lamp oil from Arlen's store account. The sight glass had clouded around its edges, but the center remained clear. When Opal struck a match, the flame traveled along the wick and settled into a small amber point. Light passed through glass once meant to measure steam pressure. It threw the crossed wheel's shadow onto the wall above Amos's photograph. Opal sat beside it until noon. The people who had brought her this far appeared in her mind through their smallest actions. The hospital guard with silver eyebrows pointing toward a warm station, without asking for an explanation. Mrs. Voss returning $5 and protecting the deed inside a stiff envelope. Hollis leaving Alder beneath the walnut trees before she had asked. Arlen opening a credit ledger for a customer who owned almost nothing. None of them had changed the whole course of her life in one grand gesture. Each had shifted one obstacle far enough for her to pass. Before we move on, think of one small kindness someone once gave you when they had no reason to help. A meal, a ride, a door left unlocked, or a sentence offered at the right hour. Tell us about it in the comments if you can. Small kindnesses often travel farther than the person who gave them will ever know. That evening, Opal placed the carving tools on the folded canvas beside her bed. She set Ruth's letter beneath the walnut case and left the brass lamp burning low until the workshop walls held its warmth. She slept with the inheritance within reach, but touched none of the money. The first snow arrived on December 2nd, 6 inches settling overnight across the walnut limbs and the western slope of the roof. Opal stood beneath the leaking ridge with the repair manual open on a flour sack and read the roofing chapter 3 times before touching a board. The workshop measured 24 by 48 feet, with 2 roof planes of roughly 600 square feet each. Allowing for overlap and waste, she calculated 42 bundles of cedar shingles, 6 rolls of felt, and 30 pounds of hot-dipped nails. Arlen delivered the materials in his flatbed and brought a narrow roofing hatchet polished pale along one cheek. "My brother used this," he said. "He is done needing it." Hollis Crane arrived the following morning carrying a carpenter's square and wearing a canvas coat repaired at both elbows. He had roofed houses for 38 years before his knees persuaded him to stop. When Opal offered payment, she looked toward the broken ridge. "Keep your money for dry lumber." They worked 11 days. Opal sistered the split western rafter with a straight length of Douglas fir. Fastening it beyond the damaged section with bolts and washers, Hollis snapped chalk lines across the felt, so each shingle course rose evenly. He taught her the 3-stroke nail technique: set, drive, finish, never crushing the cedar beneath the head. "That nail's proud," he said. Opal reached for the hatchet. By the 5th day, her wrists ached before breakfast. On the 8th, wind lifted half a row of loose shingles and carried them into the marsh. She retrieved each one from the reeds, dried them by the hearth, and began the course again. They finished on December 14th. Hollis climbed down first. Opal remained at the ridge long enough to look across Willapa Bay beneath a hard blue opening in the clouds. That night rain struck the new cedar and went no farther. January exposed what the first fire had not. 3 exterior bricks near the upper stack were spalling, their faces loosening in thin red shells, and mortar beneath the cap could be rubbed into powder between finger and thumb. Opal built a scaffold from doubled planks and spent 3 weeks repairing the chimney while daytime temperatures held between 23 and 29 degrees. She covered the work each evening with burlap and an old wool blanket to keep frost from entering the joints. Arlen helped her choose hydraulic lime, sharp sand, and fire clay. For the exterior courses, she mixed 1 part hydraulic lime to 2½ parts sand. Around the throat and upper flue joint, she added 1 part fire clay to 3 parts lime mortar. The mixture had to cling to the trowel without shining wet. She removed only 4 bricks at a time so the stack would not shift. Each replacement was soaked briefly, buttered along the bed and head joints, then pressed into line with the handle of the trowel. Her bare hands went numb every 15 minutes. Gloves were warmer, but they dulled her sense of the mortar, so she worked until her fingertips stopped distinguishing brick from air, then climbed down and held them near the stove. On January 28th, She built a test fire from dry alder and added one split of maple after the flue warmed. The smoke rose in a straight column. Inside, a strip of tissue leaned steadily toward the hearth. Nothing leaked. The chimney drew clean. Beneath the hardened sawdust, the workshop floor was white pine fastened with hand-cut rosehead nails. Water and grime had darkened it, almost black around the lathe, but the boards remained thick. Opal drove each raised nail below the surface with a square punch, then rented a random orbit sander from Arlen for $14 per day. She made 3 passes. 80 grit opened the wood and removed the grey skin. 120 erased the heavier marks. 220 left the grain smooth without polishing it shut. Dust entered her sleeves, gathered along her eyelashes, and coated the brass lamp no matter how carefully she covered it. She finished the floor in sections so she could still reach the stove. 3 thin coats of walnut oil went down with folded cotton, each rubbed until no wet patches remained. The final coat cured for 48 hours. As the oil settled, the boards changed from dark honey toward mahogany, revealing pale rings where heavy machines had once stood. One morning she woke unable to lift the sander. Her shoulders felt packed with gravel, and the journal on the counter seemed farther away than the opposite wall. She walked to the marsh instead. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, motionless except for the feathers moving at its neck. Opal watched it for nearly an hour. It struck once, swallowed a small fish, and returned to stillness. She did no work that day. The following morning, she swept the final section and continued. There were 8 windows in the workshop. 3 had no glass at all. 4 were cracked from corner to corner. The last contained a single original pane dated 1788 in Ruth's journal, a sheet of pale crown glass whose ripples bent the walnut trees whenever Opal moved past it. She preserved that pane where it was. For the others she removed each sash, labelled its weights, and softened the old putty with low heat. The replacement glass sat against glazing points spaced roughly 8 inches apart. Opal warmed DAP 33 putty between her palms, rolled it into cords, pressed it along the rabbet, and drew the putty knife in one continuous angle so the interior edge disappeared behind the muntin. The cords had rotted inside the frames. She replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, feeding each length over the pulley and securing it to the cast-iron counterweight with a figure-8 knot. The first sash dropped because she had left the tail too short. She opened the weight pocket, retied it, and tested the window 20 times. By February 9th, 7 windows opened and closed without scraping. On the last, Opal fitted a narrow pane above the rear bench and wiped away a thumbprint with newspaper. A chickadee landed on the walnut branch outside. It tipped forward, its black cap reflected faintly in the new glass, then struck the branch once with its feet and flew toward the creek. Opal lowered the sash. The counterweight descended inside the wall with a soft, balanced sound. The walls were horsehair plaster pressed over hand-split oak lath, most of it sound except near the chimney, where heat and old leaks had loosened 3 broad patches. Opal's first repair sagged before dusk. The second cracked around the edges. The third slid from the lath and landed on the floor with a sound like wet bread. Arlen brought an old feed bag containing clean horsehair saved from his father's upholstery bench. Opal cut it into short fibres and mixed it through lime plaster until each handful pulled apart reluctantly. She dampened the exposed lath, forced on a scored scratch coat, and waited until it held the pressure of her thumb. The brown coat went on 3/8 of an inch thick and cured beneath damp cloth for 72 hours. She finished with a 1/8 inch coat, drawing the steel trowel upward in slow overlapping arcs. The repaired wall was not perfectly flat. Ruth's wall had never been perfectly flat either. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Vale, who owned Pearl's Cafe, began leaving paper bags on the doorstep every Thursday. She had copper-coloured spectacles and folded the tops of the bags into exact triangles. Inside were heel slices of bread, soup in jars, and once a square of apple cake wrapped in waxed paper. Opal carried 2 empty jars into town and placed $3 beside the register. Doris pushed the money back with one flour-marked finger. The following Saturday, a boy coasted down Wilson Creek Road on a blue Schwinn with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. Caleb Klein was 16, narrow at the shoulders, and wore 1 red shoelace and 1 black. Without introducing himself, he began splitting the alder rounds Hollis had left near the chimney. Opal offered him 50 cents. He shook his head and drove the maul through another round. My mother said, "About your grandfather." That was all he gave her. By sunset, 2 straight rows of firewood stood beneath the eastern eave, bark facing outward against the rain. Reverend Boyd passed the property every morning on his walk from town to a widow's house near the tide gate. He wore a black felt hat with salt stains around the band and never entered unless invited. At the walnut trees, she tipped 2 fingers toward Opal and offered the same 4 words. Keep these hands steady. Some mornings she heard him before she saw him, his shoes pressing water from the road. The prayer never changed. Neither did the gesture. Opal postponed the cellar until February 11th because the wooden door had swollen shut and the granite steps sweated ice. When warmer rains softened the frame, she removed the hinge pins and lowered a lantern into the darkness. The cellar measured 12 by 15 feet. 7 granite steps descended to a fieldstone floor laid without mortar. Each stone fitted close enough that only thin seams of earth showed between them. At the center rested a dressed granite slab bearing the crossed wheel and carpenter's square. Opal swept around its edges but did not try to lift it. Some sealed things asked first for patience. Under the 3rd step, her broom caught against a small oak box wedged between the granite and the wall. The lid opened on wooden hinges. Inside lay a brass key whose bow had been filed into the shape of a locomotive wheel, along with a tintype wrapped in faded blue cloth. The photograph showed a young woman standing outside the workshop in the summer light. She held a wheel knife in one hand and wore her dark hair parted in the middle. The shape of her jaw, the level eyebrows, and even the slight inward turn of one foot were Opal's own. On the back, written in white ink, were the words, Ruth Mercer, daughter of Silas, aged 25, summer of 1903. Opal carried the key upstairs and set it on the mantel beside the boiler glass lamp. She tried it in the workroom cabinets, the front counter, the journal clasp, and the walnut case. It opened none of them. She left it where the firelight could reach it. By March, snow retreated into the shaded ditches. Wilson Creek grew loud with mountain runoff, and green catkins hung from the walnut trees like small untied cords. Opal opened the repaired windows each afternoon and let the workshop smell of wet bark instead of plaster. She did not begin a full wooden train that spring. The inherited tools were sharp, the patterns legible, and the dried maple waited in its wrapping, but she understood enough now to refuse haste. From the cash she selected one worn silver dollar. She recorded its date in Ruth's journal, exchanged it for maple offcuts, brass pins, and finishing oil, then practiced separate tasks, one wheel, one axle bore, one roof curve, one coupler fitted and removed. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, on December 18th, 2024, Opal fitted the final wheel to her first completed train. It was a modest freight set, a black maple locomotive, a red tender, 2 boxcars and a caboose no longer than her hand. She had shaped every body with the old patterns but left one small tool mark beneath each car, where only the maker would know to look. The axle holes carried 1/64 inch of clearance. The skew chisels had been honed at 25 degrees after warming the beeswax and walnut oil to 146 degrees, She rubbed on the finish and waited 12 full hours before attaching the couplers. At dawn, she set the train on Amos's testing plank and pushed it once. 5 cars crossed the board without wobbling. The wheels gave a low wooden murmur at each joint. When the caboose stopped, Opal did not touch it for several minutes. The workshop around her had become useful again. The treadle lathe turned without shaking. Tools hung in cut silhouettes above the bench. The repaired chimney held a quiet alder fire, and the old crown-glass window bent the winter marsh into gentle waves. Ruth's letter remained in a shallow drawer lined with cotton. The money stayed sealed in the boiler drum. That afternoon, Opal carried a ladder beneath the largest walnut tree to remove a rusted length of wire cutting into the bark. Halfway around the trunk, her knife struck metal hidden beneath lichen. A narrow brass plate had been set flush into the tree many years before. Its keyhole was almost closed with sap. Opal fetched the wheel-shaped key. It turned once. A cedar-lined compartment opened within the trunk, no deeper than her forearm. Inside rested a folded 48-star American flag protected by oilcloth and a note written in Ruth's hand. The paper was dated November 11th, 1944, 5 months after Daniel Mercer had been killed in Normandy. Ruth wrote that Daniel had been Silas's youngest grandson and the finest wheel cutter the shop had known. Before shipping overseas, he placed his flag in the walnut tree because he did not want it folded over an empty coffin. He asked that it remain there until someone restored the roof, relit the stove, and made one honest train beneath the Mercer name. The note contained no farewell grander than the work itself. If the shop is alive when this is found, Ruth had written, then Daniel has come home far enough. Opal refolded the flag along its original seams. She placed it beside the Purple Heart and closed the cedar door until the spring. On May 26, 2025, Memorial Day, she carried the medal and flag to Willamette National Cemetery in Portland. Daniel's military record did not place his body there. He remained buried in France. Still, a cemetery employee with a navy blue tie helped her register his name in the memorial archive and gave her a quiet place beside the World War II monument. Opal laid the Purple Heart on the folded flag for 1 minute. Then she brought both home. Of the hidden money, she used 4 coins. 1 paid for her first practice materials. 2 purchased replacement bearings for the treadle lathe and fire brick for the lower chimney. The 4th bought archival paper, cotton tape, and a steel document box for the letters and journal. Every withdrawal was written twice, once in Ruth's book, and once on a new ledger page headed for the next one. The remaining notes and coins returned to the canvas sacks. Opal wrapped them in fresh oilcloth, placed Daniel's medal case above them, and sealed the cedar false floor without adding wax. A future pair of hands should need care to open it, but not violence. The shop reopened without a newspaper article, ribbon, or painted announcement. Opal wrote on a plain index card and pinned it to the corkboard inside Pearl's cafe. Doris moved the card from the bottom corner to eye level. By evening, 6 names appeared on a yellow sheet beneath it. Within 3 months, the mailing list held 43, most written in the uncertain handwriting of grandparents ordering for children who lived far away. Opal made no more than 2 trains each month. Some weeks she made none. She repaired cracked wheels, replaced missing couplers, and returned old toys with their scratches intact. New wood announced repair too loudly. Matching age required restraint. Caleb returned one April morning, taller and broader, riding the same Schwinn because he said the bicycle still had work in it. A wrapped board lay across the rear rack. He carried it inside and removed the burlap. The sign had been carved from black walnut. Mercer Wooden Rail followed the old lettering exactly, but below it Caleb had added 2 words in smaller letters. Opal ran her fingertips through the cuts. "There aren't any daughters," she said. Caleb leaned the sign against the counter. Not yet. He did not mean children belonging to her. He meant Ruth, Beatrice, and every woman whose work had been entered beneath a father's or husband's name. He meant the girls who might one day stand at the lathe and learn to listen for a wheel sitting too high. They hung the sign above the double doors before noon. That autumn, Opal placed a clean sheet of archival paper beside Ruth's letter. She tested the fountain pen on a scrap, adjusted the boiler glass lamp, and began her own account. My dear one, whoever you are, she recorded where the roof still needed watching, which maple boards had seasoned longest, and how the creek rose after 3 days of eastern rain. She explained that the lathe belt slipped in cold weather, and that the left drawer stuck unless lifted at the handle. She wrote the names of Doris, Arlen, Hollis, Caleb, Mrs. Voss, and Reverend Boyd, because inheritance also depended upon remembering who carried wood, extended credit, returned money, or spoke 4 useful words at dawn. She did not describe herself as the workshop's owner. She wrote caretaker, near midnight. Wind moved through the bare walnut limbs and pressed softly against the cedar siding. Opal set down the pen, sharpened the wheel knife, and wiped the blade before returning it to Ruth's tool roll. What is made with patience remembers the hands that kept it. She extinguished the lamp, but left the front curtains open to the moon. Beyond the glass, the restored sign moved slightly on its iron hooks. The wooden toy train workshop waits. It has always waited. In the Pacific County Clerk's office, Mrs. Voss retired the following spring. Her replacement found an old $1 bill beneath the walnut desk blotter, folded once beside the original transfer receipt. Mrs. Voss asked that it remain there. It did.